All right, we're going to get started. Welcome to the first Students Talk Back Lunch of the semester. For those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet before, my name is Dan Schnur, and I'm the director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics here at SC. And as some of you know, we gather here every Wednesday for a discussion of politics, government, or public policy. And we co-sponsor these lunches with our friends at the College Democrats, our friends in the College Republicans, and our friends at the Daily Trojan. And many weeks, and fortunately for you and for me, this week I get to co-moderate the panel with one of the Daily Trojan editors, and today I'll be co-moderating with Danni Wang, who's the editorial director of the Daily Trojan. She and I, as I think you all know by now, will be leading our panel and our audience in a conversation about K-12 public education in California, more specifically a discussion about teacher evaluation, student testing, and other policy matters that have been in the news over the last several months. And in just a minute, I'll introduce our panelists, but before I do, just for a minute's worth of perspective, as many of you may know, last year, a group of students from underprivileged communities filed a lawsuit against the state of California, alleging that the practices by which teachers were hired and dismissed and assigned to their schools discriminated against children who attended schools in disadvantaged communities, depriving them of the most effective teachers. And we can talk a little bit more about the specifics behind the suit as we go forward, but the basic argument is that schools in underprivileged communities need the best teachers. And for any number of reasons, these students and their representatives alleged, too often instead of getting the very best teachers, they got the least experienced teachers, or the least motivated teachers, or the least effective teachers. And they argued in court that that was a violation of their civil rights. And the courts decided that they were correct. And although that case has been appealed, the so-called Vergara decision, named after one of the plaintiffs in that case, has in a lot of ways turned the world of K-12 public education on its ear and led to a very intense set of conversations about teacher hiring and firing, about the roles of teacher evaluations and student test scores in those evaluations, and a range of related issues as well. It's a fascinating topic. It's an important topic, but it's a very complicated topic. And so we're really, really lucky today to have four extraordinary panelists here to help us better understand these issues. And as we do every week for these programs, for the first half of the program, Danni and I will ask questions of our panelists. And then at halftime, at the halfway mark, about 30 minutes after 12, we'll turn it over to all of you. And for those of you who might have questions for our panelists, you'll have a chance to weigh in with things that you think need to be part of the conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Danni, and we'll begin the conversation.
First question is to Mike, and Teach Plus recently released poll results on teacher tenure, layoffs, and dismissal. Can you tell us about these results?
Oh my goodness. Mike, I'll let you answer in just a second. I got so wrapped up in telling you guys about the topic at hand, I didn't introduce our panelists. How embarrassing that is. So let me tell you why we're about to ask these four people questions. Oh my gosh. Mike Stryer, who is poised to begin to give a thoughtful answer to Danni's questions. Mike is the vice president for district and union policy for the Teach Plus organization. He's the former executive director at Teachers for New Unionism, and he taught social studies for 8 years at Fairfax High School in LA and was the chapter chair for United Teachers of Los Angeles. He's one of the most respected advocates for education reform in California and elsewhere. Join us in welcoming Mike Stryer. And before we let Mike answer, we'll introduce our other panelists real quickly as well. We're very, very fortunate, if you come 2 chairs over from Mike, to have Beth Shuster with us today. And this is a real fortunate opportunity for us. Because for those of you who don't know Beth, she's the education editor for the Los Angeles Times and oversees that paper's coverage of these issues on a daily basis. Before joining the Times, she worked at the LA Daily News primarily as their education reporter. And very interestingly, although not directly relevant to today's conversation, but just so you know what an impressive journalist we have here with us, Beth was the lead reporter on the 1997 North Hollywood police shootout, which won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage. I don't think we'll talk North Hollywood shootouts today, Beth, but I think we'll be nice. Please join us in welcoming Beth Shuster. And then finally, as always, because I think many of you know our rule here at the Unruh Institute is that we won't do programming unless it includes students not only as audience members, but as panelists and participants, is to have not one but two student experts in these issues. Sitting directly to my right is Jacob Ellenhorn. He's the Director of Public Relations for the USC College Republicans. And 2 seats down from him is Kevin Sanchez, former K-12 education aide for the Harlem Children's Zone, and he's currently pursuing a bachelor's of political science from the Dornsife College. Kevin, Jacob, we're really glad to have you guys here also. Now, he says embarrassingly, Danni, in fairness to Mike, do you mind putting the question to him again?
Sure. So Mike, Teach Plus recently released poll results on teacher tenure, layoffs, and dismissal. Can you tell us about these results?
Sure. When we talk about the Vergara ruling, and you may know, greater or lesser amounts about it, to me, it's a very misunderstood ruling in that we kind of saw, when the ruling came out, we saw both sides kind of saying either this is great, it's ending tenure and use of seniority and due process, or saying essentially, isn't this terrible, it ends these hard-fought protections that are absolutely vital. And in fact, there's something very, very different going on in that the judge's ruling essentially is kind of ruling on the validity of the current practices as the way they are happening. So in the midst of this kind of heated rhetoric, the voice of teachers has really been lost. I mean, the voice of teachers, hundreds of thousands of teachers are in front of students every day. So at Teach Plus, we're a teacher voice organization really looking to kind of amplify voice of teachers and policy issues. What we set out to do was to really look at what are the views of California teachers around these critical issues, around tenure, around the use of seniority and layoff policy, and around due process. Over the last couple of months, we, through an independent polling organization, reached out to 506 teachers throughout California, and I think quite a highly representative sample in terms of age, experience, location, et cetera, and found a few things, just in a nutshell. Number one, teachers highly value tenure, but feel it should be more of kind of a true earned benchmark, a true professional benchmark where there's a sufficient amount of time for teachers to demonstrate their competence. So that's one. Number two is teachers believe that classroom performance should be part of layoff decisions when layoffs are necessary. So currently, it basically revolves around seniority with some exceptions. And teachers felt, and this was interesting, they felt that overall, when there's a fair evaluation system, that 50% of that decision should be based on performance. The third thing we found was that teachers felt that their colleagues who are perhaps struggling should be better supported. However, there should be a limit to how much support is given. So if a district, school, administrators offer 2 years of strong support to a struggling teacher, they probably are not, and they don't improve, they probably are not suited for the profession. And the fourth finding we found is that teachers are passionate about having a strong voice in the policy development in these areas and feel that they need to be included both in kind of development of policy and in the implementation. So, for instance, when there's a decision about tenure, teachers absolutely should be involved in it and involved in kind of the observation and the related elements involved in that. If you want to go online on the Teach Plus website, there's an 18-page paper that reports out all the results here, but those were kind of the top-line findings that we found. And I think they're really important to consider when we're talking about issues of the complexity that we see in the Vergara case.
Thank you, Mike. And now to Beth. These issues that Mike has have addressed are controversial. And what are your reactions to these issues and addressed by the poll? And how do you evaluate the prospects for reform in these areas?
Well, I think you're right that they're controversial. However, I think a lot of people felt when that poll came out that, it was a good thing to hear that teachers wanted better, better, stronger tenure, better support for struggling teachers, that they wanted to be part of the conversation. I think some of what happens is the teachers have a very strong point of view, get their message out, and then groups like Mike's and others that are representing classroom teachers don't always also get their message out in that way. Now, that said, I should say that, we don't always write stories about polls done by advocacy groups. I mean, we work with Dan and Dornsife to do polls, and we're very, very careful to make sure that we are sort of in control of the questions and maybe in conjunction with each other, the questions and who we ask and kind of the sampling. So while I'm not discrediting the poll by any measure, I'm just saying if you, sort of look for our coverage, we're very cautious about advocacy group polling. And same with, political campaigns. And very interesting findings, tenure, layoffs, dismissal. Those are fascinating issues. Those are important issues. We should have a national conversation, in fact, about these things. And as a result of Vergara, I think we are having that conversation all around the country. However, we can't be Pollyanna-ish about this. We have to acknowledge that, there are some very strong feelings on the other side about these things. I mean, there's very strong union, California Teachers Association, American Federation for Teachers. I mean, there's a lot of very strong unions, teacher unions in this country, and they reacted very strongly to Vergara. And I think that they would maybe find some issues with some of these poll findings. But I think that it's something that is a good thing for people to discuss, and to have teachers as part of that conversation is crucial. I mean, what's more important, really, when you think about it? Do you want a politician, or do you want a teacher who's in the classroom every day, who's facing, this everything that we talk about in education, they're facing right there every day. So I think it's a great thing to have that voice in this discussion. Prospects for going forward, I think it's great that we're having a conversation about this, and the tides are changing somewhat. The Obama administration, for example, very strong on things like tenure and dismissal, and they were very supportive of Vergara. They're very supportive of evaluations. They did that whole competitive grant program called Race to the Top, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, which really tried to sort of indirectly maybe, or maybe not so indirectly, depending on your point of view, force their viewpoint on a lot of states to get money. This is what we want you to do. So it's questionable maybe of the prospects for all of these things, as we talked about Vergara's being appealed, and so it's unclear how it will come out in the end. But the timing is right, and the timing is right for your poll, and the time is right for this conversation.
Beth, thank you very much. Fortunately, we have someone with classroom experience, in addition to Mike, of course, sitting here with us today, because Jacob is not only an SC student, but he has experience working in a classroom in a lower income neighborhood in Los Angeles, Watts, if I'm not mistaken. Jacob, tell us what your experience in the classroom has helped you learn about the type of issues that Mike and Beth have been talking about for the last few minutes.
Yeah, so last year through USC, I participated in a very interesting program called the Teaching Ethics Program, where students from USC head out to underserved schools in LAUSD and teach kind of like ethics workshops with students and a couple times through their semester. So just talking about that, I really would like to just touch back on my own education. I went to a private Jewish day school, and that was because I'm, Orthodox Jewish, and, that wasn't offered in public schools. And I really I knew California had an education problem, but I didn't know how bad it was because I'd never been in an LAUSD school. And when I say private school, everyone thinks like it's a fancy preparatory school where everyone wears blazers. That wasn't the case for my education. We were a one-hallway school with leaky ceilings and no classroom supplies, everything we had to do ourselves, and that was the environment I went to school in. So going to last year, I went to the first day to go teach this class. It's a beautiful building. The hallways are immaculate. They have an amazing sports field. They have all these facilities, and you go upstairs to the classroom. The classroom has a row of computers in the back. There's all this technology in the room. And then it came to actually teaching the lesson and what we were supposed to do, and we asked the kids in the class to read something. And these were 11th graders at the second semester. And from what I could see, they were reading at maybe 4th grade level. They were sounding out words, and it was shocking to me that how can a school with so much funding have such students who can't read properly? And I think it shows, how broken our system in California is. You have these schools, there's tons of money going in, and we keep on throwing more and more money at what we see as an education problem, and no, there's barely any results besides a bunch of really nice new buildings. And I think that's a problem, and that's the kind of perspective that I got from actually being in a classroom.
And we want to come back to the funding and reform aspect of the conversation in just a few minutes. But in addition to Jacob, we want to bring Kevin into this conversation, because Kevin, you've got some hands-on real-world experience on this issue also, not only with the Harlem Children's Zone, but here in Los Angeles with Parent Revolution, working with parents in low-income communities to help them take control of the schools in their communities that their children attend. Same question to you that we put to Jacob. Talk about how your experiences impacts the way you see the types of issues that the Vergara decision dealt with that the other panelists have been discussing.
Yeah, so 2 summers ago when I was working at Parent Revolution is an organization that allowed parents or organized parents to take control of their failing schools. We would get 51% of parents to agree, and we would essentially go through this whole process, and their traditional district-run public schools they would have the option to convert them to either public charter schools or just have the district reform them as pilot schools. And what we found was generally the issues that we were tackling were the same issues Vergara was tackling, right? It was that parents felt like the quality of of their children's education was not on par with that of other parts of the city or other parts of the state or country, and they felt like they would go to administrators and they would talk to people at the district, and they wouldn't be able to get ineffective educators out of the classroom. So they would take matters into their own hands, which creates this hyper-political environment. But it became to me such a greater issue that we would have to get to that point, that the system was set up in such a way that we couldn't actually move the needle without blowing the thing up. And then this past summer when I was at the Harlem Children's Zone, which is one of the most highly respected education organizations in the country, I was confronted with issues with teacher evaluation and student testing, where we would essentially have all of our students do test prep every day for an hour, and still we didn't get anything out of it, right? Students would start skipping school. Kids didn't like testing, so they would either skip out or they would answer randomly, so the data wasn't useful. And this was probably 60 to 70% of our data. So it became an issue of practicality, right? We all want to have metrics for measuring student success, but when students aren't, let's say, into it, practically there was little point because we couldn't do very much with the data. And teacher evaluations, we would discuss that at the Harlem Children's Zone in as many ways as we could, and we would try to get teachers involved and students involved to some extent. And there's some interesting work being done at Harvard about student evaluations being effective measures and effective predictors for academic achievement in both English language arts and math. And all of these things were always considered, but it's just so difficult practically to get these things across in effective time frames. So it's just in both of those experiences, it's somewhat disheartening to have to continually fight monolithic type battles when we're just trying to move the needle for education.
Thanks, Kevin. And we'll talk about the significance of teacher evaluations and education a little later. But now a question for Mike. Beth mentioned earlier the need for teacher unions and what that means to education reform. Can you talk about why we need teacher unions and the collaboration with these unions?
Yeah, so, I think that there's a kind of tendency that we have to talk about teacher unions as kind of a monolithic force, right? Just like, and to have a broad kind of sweeping, characterization of teacher unions, whether they're unions here in California, national unions, unions across the country, as, they do this or they don't do this. And I think it's not, it doesn't allow us to really be productive. So, I think when we talk about teacher unions, we need to see that, there are a very broad range. And talking about teacher evaluations, for instance, we see a broad range of kind of responses and degrees of collaboration with teacher unions. For example, in New Haven, Connecticut, the teacher union there, which was very kind of traditional and kept to a model of kind of traditional unionism, over the last few years has really changed and worked collaboratively on developing a really, really strong evaluation model that helps kids, that teachers are really, really excited about, that's helped both teacher retention, graduation rates, student achievement and the like, some really, really positive things happening. Now, am I saying that that's happening across the country everywhere? No, but I think we need to, have some nuance when talking about unions and, where they're perceived as obstructionist or where they may be more collaborative. And I think on evaluations, it's a really good example. There's been a lot of focus on, kind of student growth measures and the like, and it's probably led us down a path where there's not kind of the discussion and open-ended discussion that could be possible in forging, more kind of constructive evaluation systems with the participation of unions. Now, is it going to happen everywhere in every place? That'd be nice to see. But, I think we need to have nuance in thinking about it.
Mike, thanks very much. And I'm going to skip a little bit and come to Beth for a moment here, just because one of the issues that's come up a couple of times here already that is, as we've heard, a particularly contentious one and a potential obstacle for the kind of collaboration that Mike was talking about is not surprisingly the issue of teacher evaluations, how teachers are evaluated, and more specifically, what sort of a role, if any, should student test scores play in those evaluations. It has become pretty contentious in a lot of arenas, Beth. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this issue from both a policy and a political standpoint.
Right, it has become contentious, but it's out there and it's happening. And I think what's sort of interesting about it is, as Mike said, you can't just do sort of a broad brush. There are a lot of states, a lot of districts now where they are incorporating student test scores in teacher evaluations as part of their evaluation. And they are looking at how effective teachers are in the classroom and measuring student achievement. The pushback is the test that they're taking a good test? Is it really an accurate measure of how well this teacher is teaching? Would it be better, for example, to have a local assessment, to have a school or a teacher in a classroom come up with his or her own assessments and then measure them? So there are a lot of variations on this. There was a report, I think it was last week, by Ed Voice that looked at the major school districts in California, and there is something called the STUL Act, which is the California law that covers teacher evaluation. And there is part of that law that says that student achievement should be looked at. It doesn't say how much. It's not totally specific about it. It doesn't say a percentage of a teacher's evaluation or anything like that. But what Ed Voice did was they surveyed sort of a lot of the major school districts in California, and they found that most do not use student achievement in evaluations. And those that do have sort of done it in a way that has made sort of the union and their teachers comfortable, which is a very important thing. But the largest ones, you know, LA Unified doesn't do it, and there are others that don't do it. Most of them don't. And, you know, you have to ask a question, you know, I mean, why not? Why not take into account, you know, how well students are learning, how well students are achieving? When they come in low, are they leaving low, or your class, or are they leaving at a really much higher level? Are there ways to look at that doesn't rely so heavily on a standardized test that a lot of teachers don't believe in? Yeah, there really are. There are a lot of ways to do this, you know, and there are a lot of ways to look at it, other than just relying on sort of the parent network standing out in a parking lot saying, oh, next year you don't want your kid to get that teacher. You know, well, what's that based on? That's based on parent chatter and rumor. And, you know, I remember my daughter was in LA Unified and going into 3rd grade, and I had this thing happen to me where everybody said to me, oh, Beth, don't let, you know, go into the principal and make sure you don't get that new teacher. And I thought, you know what, let the chips fall where they may. You know, this is a good, you know, I trust this public school. That's why my daughter's here. Let's see what happens. She got the new teacher. She was the best teacher she had in LA Unified. So, you know, rather than the one who'd been there 15 years. So, you know, I mean, let's base this on something. You know, let's try and see if there's some kind of measurement of teacher effectiveness. Because really, what is more important than having the most effective teacher in front of your children in the classroom? You know, studies have shown that ineffective teachers over, you know, couple years, 3 years in a classroom really diminishes a child's learning dramatically. And when you say, for example, Jacob, that you're in a classroom of 11th graders and they're reading at a 4th grade level, I mean, you know, that is a systemic problem, granted, but, you know, why is that being allowed to happen? Why are we moving kids along to 11th grade and they're not reading? So that's what I have to say about evaluations.
We could very easily take the rest of
We
this
could.
hour and a couple more in addition to it on this very specific question, because it's a critically important one, as Beth just said. But on the other hand, it's also certainly not the only area of education policy where there's been a great deal of discord and a lot of disagreement. Another area, of course, is where kids attend school. The proponents refer to this as school choice. The opponents refer to it as school privatization. But whether you're talking charter schools or school vouchers, there's no shortage of proposals in the mix, Jacob, about how to decide where a young person ought to attend school and who ought to make that decision. You talked about your own experience a little bit earlier. How do you see this portion of the debate playing out?
Well, I think what we're looking at right now is a government-run system that basically sets up a monopoly on where you have to send your children. You don't have a choice. If you live in a bad neighborhood and you can't afford to go anywhere else, you are stuck at that school. And I've heard, you know, horror stories of people who live in neighborhoods that can't afford to send their kids somewhere else, and their daughter is in, you know, kindergarten, and it's coming time to learn the alphabet, which is a huge foundation for reading. And the teacher sleeps through a lot of the classes because she's 80 or something, and she doesn't want to retire, and they can't get rid of her. And, you know, these are things, this is happening in our cities. It's tragic. And parents have no choice but to send their kids there. And I think if you're looking at school choice, what does that offer people? It's not privatization, it's giving them choices, and choices are really important. Also, with the opening of new schools, there's competition. There's competition between schools about who can get the most students in, and that makes schools a better place. But right now, we have a monopoly where there's no competition whatsoever, so schools can just be mediocre forever. And we have situations where kids are not learning, and we're behind in every level in this state. And I feel it's really important to implement school choice. I mean, also, you know, you're looking at California currently spends $8,600 per student to educate them per year. And, you know, imagine a voucher system. What if we gave kids these $8,600? You know, and they could use that to go to a private school. And I know you're thinking, well, aren't private schools expensive? The average private school in the United States is $8,500 a year. So we're not looking at a huge discrepancy. And I think if parents are willing to chip in money to send their kids to a good school to make sure they get an education. Right now for charter schools, there's huge waiting lists and there's lotteries and there's thousands of people waiting to get 3 spots for their children just so that they have a chance. And this is all because they have no other choice.
Well, I just want to do one other thing before we bring Kevin into this conversation on a topic that's of particular concern to him. Beth, I'm wondering if I could ask you a favor here. Your role here and at the Times is not to advocate for one side or the other in any of these debates. But in fairness, because Jacob has some fairly strong opinions on these issues, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to take a moment not to offer your own opinions, but to give us a minute or two of perspective of what those who are concerned about these types of reforms might argue. Do you mind?
Right, no. Well, I appreciate what Jacob said. I think that people would take issue with some of it because some people say that there already are choices out there. Charter schools are a choice. They are publicly funded, independently run schools. There are magnet schools. There are private schools that look for underserved minority kids because they want that for their diversity, and they will lower tuition for those students. There are other programs out there for students like that. And I think that when you say like people in a bad neighborhood are forced to send their children to bad schools, I guess I don't necessarily agree with that because there are pockets of really good things happening in LA Unified. And you can be in a neighborhood that is quote unquote bad, and your local school can be, not bad. I think Mike would totally agree with me on this. There are people in a lot of these schools that are struggling and trying really hard to do good every day for these students, and really are. We did a story one year about the best student at Washington Prep High School. And, that kid got a good education at Washington Prep, which is considered kind of not a very good high school. Now, that said, I mean, vouchers, highly, highly controversial, highly polarized conversation. We don't have them in California. There's a reason we don't have it in California. We never probably will have it in California. There aren't even a lot of states that do have vouchers. There are other ways that people are finding to promote school choice. I mean, Kevin, you talked about parent revolution. I mean, that is an answer. If 50 plus 1% of the parents at a school think their school is really underperforming and are really upset about that, there are mechanisms. In LA Unified, there must be, I don't know, a dozen different programs, right, Mike? Like, pilot schools, magnet schools, developmental schools. I mean, there are program improvement. I mean, there are so many levels of schools and the way that improvement is being looked at and that they're trying to do. But again, I think it does come down to a matter of money and desire. And, is there the desire to really, lift up these schools in these communities? I mean, I think it depends on the politics and the politicians and the money, frankly,
Thanks, Beth. Before we get to Kevin, would you like to weigh in on the comments?
Yeah, if I just quickly, I mean, I think Jacob raises some really important points kind of around the right to an appropriate education and equity issues, and I think some of the issues that were at least, directly or indirectly kind of raised in the Vergara case. I think the thing is that that a lot of the solution to me kind of lies in addressing, raising of the standards and really focusing on teacher quality issues and ensuring that there is equitable kind of distribution of our teachers, throughout schools, regardless of kind of income levels. I mean, I went to a diverse public school in Northern California, and frankly, it was unimaginable, and where I lived, that anyone would consider a private school unless you went for religious reasons, perhaps. And otherwise, you went to the public school. It was a strong public school. It was, it drew, very, diverse students, and that's what we should be striving for, at least in my opinion.
Thank you, Mike. And now for Kevin. Recent findings have stated that California has had the highest number of high school graduating students, and I guess the question is, what are your thoughts on these findings? And given what has been addressed today, what are the implications of these findings?
Yeah, so for the audience, in late April 2014, the state superintendent's office released a news report or news release stating that California's graduation rate was the highest it's ever been. It's at 80.2%. LUSD had a graduation rate of 67.9%. But given that California's graduation rate is so high, I think it's interesting to kind of think about what that means. Because I'm not sure if anyone in this room would say we're doing a fantastic job as a state. I mean, in general, people discuss education as a crisis environment. So I think it's important to say, like, what happens when we get to the 100%? Does that necessarily mean we've wholly educated everyone and that we're preparing everyone for the workforce, or does that mean we've just really fine-tuned our metrics and our potential teaching to test models, but given the conversation that we were just having about public school choice, I think it might be interesting to think about the context of the 80% graduation rate in the sense that how some schools, charter schools across the nation, have taken the progressive education model and attempted to run with it, right? I know when I was in New York, the Harlem Trojan was doing the drill and kill model. We're just going to really focus on getting our kids to graduate and do test prep and just take the system as it is and take it into hyperdrive. But right across the street, there was a school that was doing much better than we were in every sense of the word. For the past 8 years, they had 100% proficiency in English, language arts, and math. And they were taking the same students we were, they were organizing and getting kids down the block across Harlem. And they were the number one school, the number one non-selective school in New York City, 95% high school graduation and 88% college completion. Those numbers were ridiculous. And we couldn't figure it out. So I remember I went into the Harlem Village Academy, and I found that they had taken the choice to ignore the fact that there were going to be tests at the end of the year and teach an inquiry-based and knowledge-loving curriculum, right? And their kids were outperforming everyone else. I'm not sure if there's a school that does that in California, but maybe that's an interesting move in this public school choice discussion, right? We keep trying to get 80, 90, 100% high school graduation, but what schools are they actually, what education are they getting at these schools? And is that translating to college graduation? And I think that is a very important thing to kind of focus in on for the next few years.
Well, and it's a terrific way to put sort of an umbrella over the conversation of school choice that we've been having for the last several minutes. I know we want to go to audience questions in just a minute or two, but Beth, I know you wanted to weigh in too.
Yeah, I just had one thing to say about what he was saying about that. We did a story recently about a school called Drew Middle School in LA, and it used to be called Drew Zoo. I mean, it was such a mess, and it was just, kids were just walking in the halls, and, but they've really embraced, the teachers there have really embraced Common Core, and they've started, there's one teacher in particular who's doing this sort of debate, well, a lot of those teachers are actually, this debate program where they're letting students discuss sort of current events, Ferguson, for example, and other things that have happened recently. And they put on the first school-wide debate, and the kids were really engaged. And it sounds a lot like what you're saying, and it's a little bit like what Mike was saying about teacher quality and Common Core. Maybe I'm just thinking out loud here, but maybe Common Core is going to help this a little bit. You know, it's going to go a little deeper. It's going to allow teachers a little more freedom. It just sets standards. It doesn't necessarily set, you know, a prescription, although some people say it does. It doesn't necessarily set a prescribed method. It lets teachers be a little creative, maybe go a little bit deeper in the material, maybe bring in some current events, maybe bring in things that kids are hearing in their daily life. Engage them in a way that's different. And I think that's what we saw at Drew, and it was really interesting because the students were really, really engaged in a way that the principal was saying, you know, these kids, and other teachers who've been there a long time were saying these kids really haven't been. And so I think it's interesting. I mean, teach to the test has a very negative kind of connotation, but there are a lot of ways to do that, and sometimes they're successful.
Mike, before we get to audience questions, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the fact that the graduation rate is going up in LA Unified across the state, I mean, obviously that's positive, has a lot of causes that can be analyzed. Like, to me, the important part is to look, okay, is that happening across the board, or is there still a lot of inequitable distribution? When I taught at Fairfax, I can tell you, at the beginning of the year, we had 1,000 ninth graders come in, filling the auditorium, all excited. When I walked with graduating seniors, there were 450. Where did the 550 go? Okay, they simply just didn't move. They dropped out. Okay, and Fairfax is one of the better ones. Now, has it improved? Absolutely. But there are a tremendous number of schools where the rate is not 80%, but much, much less. And if we can't put our strongest teachers, you know, in front of the highest need students, we're doing an incredible disservice, and that links in with like a lot of the equity discussions that we were having before.
So
Can I say something? Should we pay teachers more to teach in? I mean, how can we address that?
So part of a much longer discussion, but I think that there is this kind of myth out there that our strongest teachers don't want to teach in kind of the lowest performing schools, most challenged schools, because it's difficult or whatever, and that's simply not true. When strong teachers are given the support and the opportunity to succeed, they absolutely will go into those schools. So maybe there's a financial element, but I think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, the first portion of our program today went a little bit longer than normal, if for no other reason than it's such a critically important and such a complicated and multifaceted topic. But we do want to make sure we get in at least a couple of questions from our audience who've been waiting patiently. So just a couple of reminders, since this is the first program of the semester. Number one, if you have a question, Danni or I will call on you, and we'd ask that number one, before you ask your question, you tell us who you are so we know who's joining in the conversation. And then second, particularly if you're going to ask a question of someone with whom you disagree, just remember that that person's not your enemy, they're not even your opponent. Someone who cares about this stuff just as much as you do, who happens to have come to a different conclusion about it. And we'd ask that you address your question with the same level of respect that you'd hope that they would show you if they were questioning you. Michael, I'll come to you on this one. How do you get the Kevins and the Jacobs and the Nathaniels to decide to teach for a living instead of going to Wall Street?
So, you know, to me it comes down to, I think that we need as teachers, as educators, you know, to take greater ownership of the profession. Why is it that other professions, whether they're you know, in the medical profession or legal profession, seem to take, you know, greater ownership? In the teaching profession, you know, at least in many places, there's kind of this ceding of authority, whether it's to administrators or policymakers and the like, and I think that there are reasons for it. But what, like, just circling back to the poll, I mean, what was so clear in the poll was that teachers want to take ownership of the profession. They're saying tenure should be an earned professional benchmark. And so I think when you start going down that path and raising the expectations and, you know, making sure that there is ownership in the profession, I think that more competitive pay hopefully will come with that, and that there'll be greater public support for it. So that would be my hope.
Kevin.
So I recently read Finnish Lessons, which is a book that kind of describes what Finland did to become one of the best countries in the world in education. And their model is essentially forcing every teacher to have a master's degree in something they were teaching, and then paying teachers a competitive salary to what they would be making had they just gone into their profession. And what that created was this competitive environment where to become a teacher in Finland, it was almost as difficult as getting into Harvard. I think it's like 4 or 5% of applicants get into the teacher academies. Not all of those actually leave teacher academies able to teach. So I think it's more of, I think people want to be teachers. I think it's a profession people want to go into, right? You get some free time in the summer to either better your craft or just do whatever you want to do to some extent, and you get to work with children, you get to mold minds, and I think that's something people want to do, but it's too difficult, especially if you're coming from a low-income background, to work as hard as you have and maybe get a degree in economics, and then currently decide then to make $50,000 a year instead of maybe $100 on Wall Street. And if that was to flip, I think we'd have a much more competitive environment in which the public would be much more open to paying teachers higher salaries.
Other questions?
I was
Yes.
just going to say
Yeah, of
one
course,
quick
Beth.
thing on that. I think that when, you know, prospective teachers see that, you know, every March 15th in California, for example, these letters go out that say you may not have a job next year, you know, these layoff letters. I think there's so much job insecurity for teachers. I think that's one reason why it's a tough thing to go into. Secondly, the Obama administration is trying right now to look at colleges that prepare teachers, teacher prep programs. And one of the things that they find, you know, Arne Duncan, the U.S. Secretary of Education, said that when he goes into classrooms, one of the questions he typically asks teachers is, when you came into this classroom, did you feel prepared to be here? And he says the majority of teachers say no. I really didn't have any idea. I graduated from XX school, I got this degree, I got this credential, but no. I had no idea until I walked in the classroom. So, I mean, teacher prep is a really important thing. On the other hand, look at, I'm sure Mike will have something to say about this, but look at Teach for America. How come they get, you know, how come they're getting the best students in America to join their program? You know, they say come and be a teacher for a couple of years or more. You know, start out with us, we'll help you get a credential. Will put you in some of the worst schools in America. Why is it that all of those students from Harvard and USC and, you know, University of North Carolina, et cetera, why is it that they're all trying to go to Teach for America? You know, so I think there are ways to make it appealing. I think there are ways, I mean, money, one of them, but there are a lot of ways, you know, increase the standards, you know, make it harder to get into a teacher college. Anyway, I think there are a lot of different ways.
No question, and moderator's prerogative for a moment, no question that a financial incentive is a very, very significant one for any prospective teacher, young or old. But I'd ask you this, regardless of the field that interests you for a living when you graduate, if you were told that you wouldn't know until March of every year whether you'd have a job the next year and where you'd be doing that job, that sounds to me like a pretty powerful disincentive to take on any career. Young man, your name? Kevin, it looks like you've got a thought on this.
Yeah, so I know given the infusion of technology in the classroom, we have tons of different schools and individual teachers all over the place trying to do that exact thing, in which they try to have assessments at the beginning of the year to see where their students lie, either in reading or math, and then they kind of group kids up within the classroom and use technology-based systems to keep kids going at a different pace so they can kind of help develop the skills that each one has in the most effective and positive way for those groups of students, right? Because if you can't read, it's very difficult to start reading at an incredibly high rate, or if you can't do basic algebra, you can't really go into trigonometry. So I think technology gives us the freedom to do that at a micro level, which then I think can just be extrapolated across all school sites and all districts.
And Jacob, I wonder if this doesn't get to your question about school choice, which is rather than suggesting that every school follow Sam's suggestion or that none of them do, allowing parents to decide whether they would prefer for their child to be educated with their chronological peers or their educational
Right.
peers.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of the times when we have like a complex situation, like, you know, education systems, we try to figure out kind of a newfangled approach and a way to kind of like attack the issue and try to take care of it. And I don't think we need to reinvent kind of like our education wheel and like kind of like take from the Finnish system and have kids divided based on ability and not age. I mean, we have a system that worked for a very long time in this country. You had first grade, second grade, third grade, and so on. And I don't think that was the problem. The problem that we have here is that you have schools that don't have good teachers, and you also don't have like a lot of choice for parents. And I feel that, you know, if parents decide to send their kids to a school like that, that's fine for them and they should go ahead and do that. But I don't think that we need to like reinvent the way we teach students in this country. We just need to take care of the system.
Mike or Beth, would you like to offer a last word either on this or on another topic that we haven't had a chance to get to today? Oh, look at all these manners. Go ahead, Beth.
Only one thing I would say, since we mentioned other countries, and I have read a couple of books about sort of latest books about how they educate kids in other countries, and I've seen firsthand. I was on a fellowship in China, and I've seen firsthand schools there. And one thing that really leapt out at me from reading and from seeing firsthand is there's a lot of teacher observation that goes on to improve the quality of teaching. In China, for example, I was in a classroom, and there must have been 10 teachers in the back of a classroom, while this one teacher was just teaching math. And, you know, they were there to observe, and they're there to comment on how this teacher was doing, and they were there to learn themselves. And, you know, I find a lot of times in LA Unified, for example, that teacher goes in, closes the door, that's it. Like, we did some stories not too long ago, a few years ago, and one of the best teachers at the school was teaching in a classroom next door to a teacher who was doing not well at all, and their students weren't doing as well. And it's like, well, why? Why wasn't that shared? Why didn't that teacher in that classroom who was doing so well, you know, why wasn't it a shared experience? You know, come and watch me do math with these third graders, and then I'll come and watch you do English, and you know, it just doesn't happen so much. And it's I think it's a really important thing. I mean, I know I learned about journalism a lot. I'd say probably the most from listening to my colleagues and watching my colleagues and looking at the best ones and reading their work and seeing how they, you know, how do they conduct interviews, who do they talk to, how well do they write. You know, I learned tremendous amount from my colleagues, and I believe that that's sort of the way to learn.
Listen, I would be very, very happy to keep this conversation going for another hour at least, but I'd get in real trouble with my colleagues at the Unruh Institute. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, but before I do, just a couple of quick announcements. First of all, this Friday is our deadline for internships for spring semester. Poli-Sci 395 offers between 2 and 8 academic credits for working in a campaign in the office of an elected official or at an organization that advocates for issues that are important to all of you. and two in particular that are still available, two pretty enticing ones, is LA County Supervisor Mike Antonovich and Los Angeles City Council President Herb Wesson have both let us know, sort of at the last minute, that they have another opportunity available for a qualified intern. And I'd hate to see somebody from UCLA get those opportunities. So if somebody in this room wants them, make sure to visit Jody Epstein over at the Unruh Institute at VKC 263, and she'll set you up. Second, just a reminder, next Wednesday's lunch discussion, we will have Warsaw Chair Bob Shrum here with us, along with other journalists and politicos. And the topic of that discussion is Obama in Congress, can this marriage be saved? And for those of you who attended our State of the Union program last week, you might be skeptical that there's prospects, but we'll talk that through a week from today in this room. Also next Wednesday evening, we'll have our first roundtable discussion that we co-sponsor with the Political Student Assembly. And both of our legislators in residence, former State Senator Mark Weiland and former State Assembly Member Anthony Portantino will be here. Will be not here. Will be where? Help? Mudd Hall, room 102, to talk about the issues of the day with two former legislators who know these issues very, very well. And then third and finally, not next Monday, but a week from Monday, February 9th, is the deadline for applications for this spring's Sacramento Joe Sorrell Seminar. And for those, as some of you may know, every spring we take a selected group of USC students to Sacramento for 3 days to meet with legislators, with lobbyists, with political consultants, even with political journalists, and to talk with them about what's going on in state politics and state government. The seminar is all paid for. We pay airfare, hotels, and related expenses, but the catch is you have to apply. So come by the Unruh Institute at some point over the next few days, pick up an application, or go to our website, and you can get the application there as well. So finally, most importantly, join me in thanking the entire Unruh staff, the entire Unruh team for what they do to put these programs on every week. Thank Kirsten Olson, thank Jody Epstein, thank Alyssa Rangel, thank Tanya Mercado, and especially thank Laura Hill for all the good work they do to make these programs come off. Thank you guys very, very much. Thanks to our partners at the College Republicans, the College Democrats, and the Daily Trojan, and especially to my co-moderator, DT Editorial Director Danni Wang. Danni, thank you so much. And finally, please join me in thanking our panelists, Jacob Ellenhorn, Kevin Sanchez, Beth Shuster, and Mike Stryer, for a fascinating conversation. Guys, we really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you so much.